The alien jungle around her pulsed with a life entirely foreign to her. A symphony of strange, unsettling sounds echoed through the dense foliage, blending with the thick, acrid air that hung heavy with moisture. Towering trees loomed overhead, their massive skeletal branches twisted like ancient hands, their bark glowing faintly with iridescent veins. Beneath her feet, the soil was soft and warm, almost as if the planet itself was alive, reaching up to claim her. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Calla's face was smeared with dirt, streaked with the remnants of her painful journey. Her young amber eyes were sharp, gleaming with determination far beyond her years. In her hands, she gripped a crude bow, fashioned from the bones of the aliens who had once tortured her. It felt as if it were part of her now, an extension of her very soul. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from a burning anticipation. The memory of her escape was seared into her mind, vivid and raw like the scars that marred her skin. She remembered the cold, sterile halls of the alien compound, the harsh, artificial lights that flickered overhead, and the monstrous, distorted faces of her captors. At just 10 years old, they had snatched her from Earth, pulling her from the safety of her own backyard. For 2 long years, they had subjected her to cruel, inhumane experiments, injecting her with alien serums that twisted her DNA, turning her own body against her. They had wanted to break her. They wanted to see just how much a human could endure before shattering. They tested her limits, forcing her bones to ache, her mind to stretch, and her strength to bend. But in the end, they had made a grave mistake. The last experiment had unlocked something in her, a sharpened mind, heightened reflexes, and strength beyond anything she had ever known. They had sought to create a weapon, but they had only unleashed her wrath. Now, in the dense underbrush, Calla crouched low, her breath steady and controlled. Ahead, the alien patrols moved through the jungle, their shimmering armor casting an eerie glow under the faint light filtering through the canopy. She could hear the hum of their energy weapons and the strange clicking of their inhuman voices. They were hunting her, but this time, she was the one doing the hunting. With a fluid motion, she drew her bow back, feeling the tension in the sinew fibers. The arrow, a jagged shard of alien metal, glinted in the muted light. She took a deep breath, her muscles coiled tight like a spring, and then released. The arrow flew through the air with a sharp whistle, striking the lead alien in the helmet with deadly precision. The creature collapsed, its body crumpling without a sound. The remaining patrol members turned toward the disturbance, their eyes wide in alarm, but Calla was already gone, slipping through the dense jungle like a shadow, her body moving instinctively, faster than they could track. This was her jungle now. Tharim Prime was a hostile world, a labyrinth of bioluminescent forests, jagged cliffs, and a toxic atmosphere thick with shimmering spores. The spores were mesmerizing but deadly, and Calla had learned the hard way to avoid them after a single careless breath left her gasping for air and coughing blood. Predators and prey were indistinguishable here. The creatures were as strange and deadly as the world itself. A massive, translucent serpent slithered above her, its organs pulsing beneath its skin like a grotesque display. Calla froze, her heart hammering in her chest as its milky eyes scanned the ground below. It lingered for a moment, sensing something, before moving on. The rustle of leaves was the only sound it left behind. This was her reality now, fighting to survive in a world that seemed designed to kill her. But it was still better than the compound. She remembered the moment, burned into her mind, her dirt-smeared face framed by sweat-matted hair, her eyes blazing with defiance. She had stood like that only days before, facing one of her former captors. The insectoid creature towered over her, its segmented limbs moving with an eerie grace. It had thought she was weak, harmless, just another specimen. It hadn't seen her as a threat. That was its mistake. Her bow had been steady in her hands as she fired. The arrow had embedded itself deep into the creature's armored chest, and for the first time, Calla had seen the surprise in its multifaceted eyes. Pain, fear, and confusion had flickered in its gaze as it crumpled to the ground, alien blood pooling beneath its twitching body. Victory. For the first time, Calla had tasted it. And in that moment, something shifted deep within her. She wasn't just a victim. She was a warrior. She could fight back. That moment had changed everything. The dirt-smeared girl with defiant eyes, her hands wrapped around a bow, had become the symbol of her own resistance. She was no longer prey. She was their reckoning. As Calla moved deeper into the jungle, the presence of another being suddenly became apparent. She paused, her heightened senses alert. Soft, deliberate footsteps reached her ears, human, or at least, not alien. She waited, listening, as from the shadows emerged a figure. Tall, humanoid, but clearly not one of the invaders. Another survivor, or something else. Calla's hand tightened on her bow as she prepared for what might come next. The figure emerged from the dense foliage like a ghost, tall and lean with an air of quiet intensity. It wasn't alien, but it wasn't human either, not fully. Calla's eyes narrowed, scanning the figure for any signs of threat. The last 2 years had taught her to trust no one, not even those who looked like they might share her struggle. The stranger stood motionless, watching her with calm, measured eyes. His features were sharp, angular, with a pale complexion that seemed almost translucent in the dim glow of the jungle. His eyes, though, were unmistakable, human, though filled with a wildness that spoke of too many days spent in a world not meant for survival. "Who are you?" Calla's voice was low, sharp, like a whip. She kept her bow ready, her fingers lightly brushing the string, prepared to unleash an arrow at a moment's notice. Her senses screamed at her to be cautious. The jungle had taught her to trust nothing without first testing it. The stranger didn't flinch. Instead, his lips curled into a faint smile, and he raised his hands, palms out in a gesture of peace. "Not your enemy," he said in a hoarse voice. "I'm just surviving." Calla's grip on her bow didn't loosen, but she studied him with a new wariness. Surviving. She knew that word all too well. But what kind of survival was he speaking of? He looked like someone who had been on this world longer than she had, but there was something about him, something off, like he had been marked by this jungle in a way she hadn't been. He stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate, respectful of her space. "I've seen what you can do," he continued, his voice tinged with awe. "I'm not here to fight you. I need help." Calla's heart hammered in her chest as his words sank in. Help. She had given up on help a long time ago. This world didn't offer help. It only took. It only destroyed. She took a step back, narrowing her eyes. Help with what? The man's smile faded, replaced by a deep, haunted look. "I've been here longer than I care to admit. I've seen what they do to us. What they did to you." He paused, his gaze flicking over her dirt-streaked face, the scars marring her skin, the bow in her hands that had become her lifeline. "I was with the resistance. I tried to fight back. But they were too strong." His words made her pause. Resistance? Her mind raced. She had heard rumors, whispered in the deepest shadows of the compound. The idea of a resistance movement, a group of survivors fighting back against their alien captors, felt like a fantasy, something far removed from her own grim existence. But the man's eyes told a different story. His pain was raw, real. "What happened?" Calla asked, her voice softer now, though still guarded. She lowered the bow slightly but didn't let it out of her reach. The man's eyes darkened, and he looked away for a moment, as if the memory pained him. When he spoke again, his words were heavy, weighed down by loss. "They hunted us. One by one. They picked us off. The aliens, they know how to track us. They," He swallowed hard, then turned back to her. I'm the last one left. The last of the ones who fought. And now they've come for me. Calla didn't respond immediately. Her mind was racing. The last one? She had no idea what that meant for her. She had been alone for so long, fighting alone, running alone. The thought of joining forces with someone, especially someone who had been with a resistance that had failed, was terrifying. She wasn't sure she was ready for that kind of trust, or that kind of hope. But then she remembered the look in the man's eyes. The fear. The desperation. She had seen it before, on the faces of her captors as they finally realized she was no longer their victim. Fear was a tool. One she knew how to use. You want me to help you? Calla asked, her voice flat but edged with suspicion. Why? His lips quirked into a bitter smile. Because if you don't, we're both dead. That gave Calla pause. She studied him, her eyes narrowing once more as she searched for any sign of deception. The jungle around them seemed to close in, its oppressive, breathing presence heightening her instincts. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. Not now, not when survival was so fragile. Where did they go? She asked, a sudden realization dawning. Where are the others? The ones who hunted you. The man stiffened, his gaze flicking briefly to the shadows where the jungle's dense underbrush obscured much of the world beyond. They'll be back soon. They're always back. They never stop hunting. Calla's blood ran cold. The thought of more of them, more aliens, finding them was terrifying. She had learned the hard way that when they came, they didn't just come to capture, they came to kill. She glanced over her shoulder, taking in the vastness of the jungle. It was both her sanctuary and her prison, but with the aliens closing in, she knew there was no place that would be truly safe. I don't need help, she said finally, her voice firm. But I do need information. Where do I find them? The man's face hardened as he considered her question, his eyes flicking to the shadows. I know a place, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. A place they don't go. But it won't be easy. It's guarded. And even if we get there, we'll need to fight our way through. Calla didn't hesitate. She nodded sharply. Fighting was all she had left. Lead the way, she said, tightening her grip on her bow. I'll take my chances. As they moved through the jungle together, Calla couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something new, or the last mistake she would ever make. The jungle had a life of its own. Beneath the weight of its thick, glowing canopy, the air hung heavy with a humidity that seeped into every pore. The spores shimmered like faint stars in the distance, a toxic beauty that threatened to suffocate them. Calla felt the familiar pull of the forest, the urge to disappear into its shadows. But for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't alone. And that made every movement, every sound, a little more dangerous. The man, whose name she had yet to ask, moved silently beside her. He was surprisingly quick, gliding between the trees with an ease that made her question how long he had been surviving in this hostile world. Calla's eyes remained fixed on the jungle ahead, but she could feel the man's presence beside her, steady and watchful. Every now and then, she would glance at him from the corner of her eye, noting the tension in his posture, the alertness in his movements. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was a necessary partnership. For now. They moved swiftly, through the dense underbrush and towering trees. Calla's senses were on high alert, every sound and shift in the wind sharp in her ears. She could feel the vibrations in the ground, the subtle rustling of leaves, the weight of eyes watching from unseen places. The jungle didn't hide its predators. It only made sure that its prey never knew what was coming until it was too late. Stay close, the man muttered, his voice low but urgent. We're near their patrol route. Calla nodded without speaking, her bow clutched tightly in her hands. She had learned the rhythm of the jungle, its patterns and its threats. And the aliens were no exception. They had their patrols, their routines, their blind spots. But they also had their technology, tools and weapons that made them terrifyingly effective hunters. They moved deeper into the jungle, past thick vines and strange, bioluminescent plants that seemed to glow in the dark, their tendrils reaching like alien fingers. The world here was so different from Earth, both beautiful and terrifying. And Calla knew that at any moment, the serene beauty of the jungle could turn into a deadly trap. It was the sound of footsteps that stopped her. Heavy, mechanical, and unmistakably alien. Her heart skipped a beat as she held her breath, listening. They were close. Too close. The man crouched beside her, his eyes narrowing. "They're coming," he whispered. "Stay still." Calla's body tensed, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the faint hum of their energy weapons, the soft metallic clink of their armor as they moved through the underbrush. The aliens didn't make a lot of noise when they were hunting. They didn't need to. But Calla had learned to recognize the subtle shifts in the air, the way the jungle seemed to go quiet just before danger arrived. She lowered herself to the ground, pressing her body against the cool earth, her breath shallow and steady. The man beside her did the same, moving with practiced precision. Calla could feel the tension between them, the unspoken understanding that, if they were spotted, there would be no running. Not this time. The aliens moved past them, their forms glowing faintly in the dim light, like wraiths among the trees. Calla could see them now, tall, armored figures, their skin an unnatural shade of grey, their faces hidden behind helmets that obscured any trace of humanity. They passed within a few meters of her, their voices low and garbled, the strange clicking sounds of their language vibrating through the air. Calla didn't move. She didn't even breathe. The patrol moved on, fading into the jungle as quietly as they had come. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the stillness thick with the weight of their narrow escape. Finally, the man broke the silence. "We'll have to move fast now. We're close." Calla nodded, her muscles still coiled with the adrenaline of the near miss. "Close to what?" He glanced at her, his expression serious. "The outpost. Where they keep the prisoners. It's heavily guarded, but it's the only place where we'll find answers." Calla's pulse quickened. The outpost. The place where the aliens kept their captives. It was a dangerous place. She had heard whispers about it from the few prisoners who had managed to escape. The stories were always the same: torture, experimentation, and death. But it was also the place where they kept the technology that could help her escape. The weapons, the ships, the tools of their cruel reign. It was the only chance she had left. They moved through the jungle again, this time with more urgency, knowing that their luck wouldn't last forever. Every step brought them closer to the outpost, and to whatever lay within. The further they went, the more the jungle seemed to shift. The air grew thick with tension, and the underbrush became sparse, replaced by rocky terrain that seemed more desolate than anything Calla had seen before. The trees began to thin, and the bioluminescent plants gave way to jagged, black rocks that jutted out from the ground like the bones of some ancient creature. Then they saw it. The outpost. It stood in stark contrast to the jungle, a hulking structure of metal and stone, its jagged walls rising from the barren landscape. It was a fortress, heavily guarded, with watchtowers at every corner and automated drones patrolling the perimeter. There was no way in without being noticed, no way to approach without setting off alarms. Calla's heart raced as she studied the structure. She had to get inside. She had to find a way to fight back. But she also knew that the moment they were seen, everything would be over. "We need a plan," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "We can't just walk in." The man nodded, his eyes scanning the outpost carefully. "We don't walk in. We create a distraction. I know a way in through the south wall. It's less guarded." Calla's gaze hardened as she studied the outpost. There was no time to waste. Every minute they spent waiting gave the aliens more time to hunt them down. "Then we move," she said. "We take them by surprise." And with that, the two of them disappeared into the shadows, ready to face whatever. The moonless night stretched ahead, thick with shadows, as Calla and the man, whose name she had yet to ask, crept toward the southern wall of the outpost. The air was dense with the smell of decay, the jungle closing in on them like a living, breathing entity. The rhythmic hum of the alien outpost's energy shields buzzed in the distance, an unsettling reminder that they were walking straight into the heart of enemy territory. Calla's bow was slung across her back, but her hand rested on one of her arrows, ready to pull it free at the slightest movement. The man, moving with practiced silence, led the way, his sharp eyes scanning every corner, every crevice in the walls. His footsteps were soft but purposeful, calculated, nothing like the frantic, adrenaline-fueled scramble that marked her early days in the jungle. He had clearly been here before. They reached the base of the southern wall, which was slick with moisture and lined with alien markings, strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. The man pointed to a series of exposed pipes running along the wall, their rusted metal surface covered in strange, glowing moss. "This is the spot," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the faint breeze. He dropped to a crouch, inspecting the area. "There's a maintenance shaft here. They use it for repairs. It's not heavily guarded, but we need to move quickly." Calla nodded, already feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline flood her system. The thought of getting inside, of possibly finding the weapons or technology that could help her escape, was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her mind was razor-sharp, the horror of her time in the compound still fresh in her mind. She was a weapon now, but there was more to her than just survival. She needed to get out. To end this nightmare. The man pulled at one of the pipes, and the metal creaked under his touch. It shifted slightly, revealing a small opening just large enough for them to squeeze through. His eyes flicked to her, a silent question in them. Without a word, Calla dropped to her knees, slipping through the gap and into the narrow shaft. It smelled of oil and rust, the air stale and thick. She could hear the faint hum of machinery running behind the walls, the pulse of the outpost's core thrumming like a living thing. They moved quickly through the maintenance tunnel, their footsteps muffled by the metal walls. Calla kept her senses sharp, listening for any sound that might indicate the presence of guards or patrols. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the flickering lights overhead only added to the oppressive atmosphere. The deeper they went, the colder it became. The tunnel seemed to grow longer, stretching into darkness with no clear end in sight. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a large, circular chamber. It was dimly lit, the walls lined with strange alien equipment, computers and devices she didn't understand, their screens flickering with incoherent symbols. At the far end of the room, a large metal door stood, flanked by two towering guards, alien creatures that looked like a cross between armored insects and humanoid warriors. Their helmets were covered in dark, reflective glass, and their body armor shimmered with an eerie, bioluminescent glow. Calla's pulse quickened, but the man beside her was already moving. He pulled a small device from his belt, a makeshift EMP jammer, and activated it. A low hum filled the room as the alien machinery around them flickered and buzzed, the lights dimming and the humming of the walls momentarily silencing. The guards, momentarily disoriented by the malfunction, looked around, their bodies rigid and alert. Calla didn't waste a second. She pulled an arrow from her quiver, narked it, and drew the string back with a practiced ease. The arrow, tipped with a shard of alien crystal scavenged from wreckage, was designed for one thing: to kill. With a breath, she let the arrow fly. It whistled through the air and struck the lead guard in the chest, right between the plates of its armor. The creature let out a gurgling hiss, staggering back before crumpling to the floor in a heap of twitching limbs. The second guard reacted instantly, reaching for its weapon, but the man was already moving. He leaped from his position, a knife flashing in the dim light, and sliced through the creature's throat before it could raise an alarm. The room fell silent, save for the echo of their breaths. Calla stood frozen, her hand still gripping the bow, her body poised for the next threat. She glanced at the man. His face was hard, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something like respect. "Nice shot," he murmured, already moving toward the metal door. Calla didn't respond. There was no time for words. She followed him as he approached the door, working quickly to bypass the security system. The machinery buzzed softly as he hacked into the control panel, his fingers flying over the alien interface with surprising ease. It wasn't the first time he had done this. After a tense moment, the door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a dark hallway beyond. It was quiet, too quiet, but Calla knew better than to think it was empty. This was the heart of the outpost, and danger lurked in every corner. They crept through the hallway, the dim lights above casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. Calla's eyes darted around, every sense alert. Her heart beat in time with her footsteps, each echo a reminder of the risk they were taking. Every step was a gamble, one she wasn't sure she could afford to lose. Ahead, the hall split into two directions. The man stopped, glancing down each path. "Your choice," he said. "We need to find the main control room. It's where they keep the data, everything we need to know about the operations here. If we're lucky, there might be something to help us take this place down." Calla didn't hesitate. She turned left, moving swiftly down the corridor, her bow drawn and her eyes scanning every corner. The deeper they ventured, the more the air seemed to hum with the energy of the outpost. It was as if the building itself was alive with secrets. And Calla had only one goal now, to uncover them. They passed through several more security checkpoints, avoiding patrols with quiet precision, until they reached a large door at the end of the hall. The man moved to the panel, but before he could reach it, a sharp noise echoed from behind them, footsteps growing louder. Calla spun around, her muscles coiling, ready to spring into action. The sound of heavy boots clicking against the metal floor told her all she needed to know. "Get ready," the man hissed. A new wave of adrenaline surged through Calla's body. They weren't alone anymore. The outpost had noticed them. The hallway seemed to close in around them as the footsteps grew louder. Calla's breath quickened, and her heart pounded in her ears. She could feel the heat of fear creeping up her spine, but she shoved it down, focusing on the present, on the here and now. They had no time. No room for mistakes. The man beside her was already moving, his hand on the door panel, but it wasn't fast enough. Calla's senses sharpened. She could hear the distinct hum of alien energy weapons charging. The sound sent a chill through her, but she didn't flinch. She had learned to fight her instincts, to control the panic, to think, to survive. The door hissed as it slid open, but it was too late. A squad of aliens emerged from the hallway behind them. 4 of them, their gleaming, insectoid armor catching the dim light. Their weapons glinted ominously. Calla's stomach twisted with the cold certainty that they were here to capture or kill. She had faced them before, but this was different. The time for stealth was over. "Move," the man shouted, grabbing Calla by the arm and pulling her toward the door. But the aliens were already closing in, cutting off their escape. Calla's grip tightened on her bow. She had learned how to fight with it, how to make it an extension of herself. The thought of escape flickered through her mind, but she knew better. If they didn't act fast, they would be dead, or worse, captured again. She didn't hesitate. The first alien raised its weapon, a sleek energy rifle, aimed directly at her. Calla's fingers flew to the string of her bow, pulling it back in one fluid motion. The arrow flew, a streak of silver light in the dim hallway, and the alien's head snapped back as the arrow drove through its visor. The alien crumpled, its weapon discharging a burst of energy into the ceiling, igniting sparks. The remaining 3 aliens hesitated for only a moment, their eyes narrowing as they assessed the situation. Then they fired. Energy bolts zapped through the air, hitting the walls around her, sending sparks showering down like rain. Calla ducked and rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding a blast that singed the edge of her sleeve. "Get in," the man shouted, already darting through the door and into the room beyond. Calla followed, shooting another arrow as she moved, but this time the alien dodged, and her shot missed. The door slammed shut behind them with a loud clang. They were in some kind of control room, dimly lit with screens flashing alien text and diagrams. It was cold in here, the walls sleek and metallic. Calla's heart raced as she spun to face the door. The sound of the aliens banging against it, their fists slamming into the metal, echoed in her chest. They weren't going to let them get away that easily. "They'll breach the door in seconds," the man said, his voice steady, despite the urgency of the situation. "We need to get to the main console." Calla nodded, her mind working quickly. She scanned the room, eyes darting from screen to screen, trying to make sense of the alien symbols. It was all a blur, but one thing stood out, a central terminal at the far end of the room, its interface blinking, awaiting input. "Cover me," she said, already moving toward the terminal. The man didn't question her. He took up a defensive position near the door, his eyes darting to the flickering monitors as he scanned for any sign of reinforcements. Calla reached the terminal and, without hesitation, began pressing buttons, her fingers moving across the alien interface. It was alien technology, but she had been observing, learning, adapting. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as she worked to decipher the patterns, the symbols. Her mind was sharp, her senses keen. The aliens had made her stronger, faster, smarter. The door shuddered under the impact of the aliens' blows. Calla cursed under her breath as she pressed harder, her fingers flying across the screen, trying to make sense of the alien system. Then, click, a sequence of symbols appeared on the screen. She barely had time to process the meaning before a soft ping sounded from the terminal, signaling that she had gained access. But it wasn't enough. "Give me a distraction," she shouted to the man. The door groaned again, and she could hear the aliens' distorted voices through the metal. They were preparing to break through. The man didn't hesitate. He sprang into action, using the environment to his advantage. He grabbed an object from the workbench near the wall, an alien device of some kind, and hurled it at the door. The device exploded on impact, sending sparks flying and the door rattling violently. The aliens paused for a moment, their voices muffled, as if they were trying to assess the damage. Calla didn't waste a second. With one final push, her fingers danced across the terminal. A series of codes appeared on the screen, and a green light flashed. The main control system unlocked. She breathed a sigh of relief. "Now, let's get out of here," she said, before turning toward the man. But before they could move, the entire room plunged into darkness. The emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in a sickly red glow. The buzzing hum of the outpost's energy shields grew louder, a warning signal of impending danger. The air felt charged with electricity, as if the very walls were alive with the energy of the outpost's core. Calla's heart skipped a beat as she turned to the man. "What did we do?" "We activated the main system," he said, his voice laced with tension. "They'll know we're here now, and they won't stop until they find us." A series of loud, mechanical clanks echoed through the room. The wall nearest them began to shift, as if part of the room itself was opening. Calla readied her bow, her breath steady. "Then we fight." From the shadows, monstrous shapes began to emerge, alien creatures, towering and menacing, their forms half hidden in the red light. Some were humanoid, others more insect-like, their glowing eyes gleaming in the dark. Calla's grip tightened on the bow. They had come for her once before. Now she would make them regret it. "Let's finish this," she whispered, as the door to the next battle opened wide. The red emergency lights bathed the room in a blood-like glow, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe. The heavy hum of the alien machinery reverberated through the walls, growing louder as the shapes emerged from the darkness. They moved with unnatural grace, their glowing eyes fixed on Calla and the man. Calla's fingers tightened on the bowstring. Her muscles coiled like a spring, ready to unleash another shot. The creatures were closing in, their forms shifting in the dim light, their footsteps making no sound on the metal floor. A cold chill ran down her spine, but there was no fear this time, only resolve. She had already faced down countless enemies. She had survived their experiments, their cruelty. Now she was in control. The man, standing beside her, was already pulling a strange weapon from his belt, a plasma blade. He ignited it with a snap, the blue blade humming to life, casting a sharp light over his features. His eyes locked onto the nearest alien, a hulking beast with 4 arms and a plated exoskeleton. It hissed, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and advanced, its energy rifle raised. "Stay back," the man growled. "This is my fight." Calla ignored him, her mind focused entirely on the threat before her. She wasn't going to stand by and wait for someone else to fight her battles. As the lead alien lunged, its energy rifle discharging in a burst of blue light, Calla released the string. The arrow flew faster than the eye could follow, piercing the alien's chest, directly through the thin armor at its heart. The alien stumbled, its rifle discharging into the ceiling as it dropped to the ground with a heavy thud. Another alien, a sleek, spider-like creature, skittered forward, its legs clicking against the floor. It raised a clawed hand, aiming to swipe at her with terrifying speed. Without hesitation, Calla drew another arrow, narked it, and fired. The shaft buried itself into the creature's skull, and it crumpled to the floor in a heap of twitching limbs. The man, seeing the success of her attack, grinned. "Not bad, kid." But Calla wasn't listening. She was already moving again, eyes darting to the next threat. A pair of alien soldiers, their bodies encased in glowing armor, approached from opposite sides, their weapons raised. The man lunged first, his plasma blade slashing through the air in a deadly arc. One soldier tried to block with its own energy sword, but the man's blade was faster, cutting through its defense and cleaving the alien in half. The creature let out a guttural screech before collapsing to the floor in a pile of glowing fragments. Calla didn't wait for the other alien to react. She fired another arrow, the sharp metal tip slicing through the air with a whistle, and the remaining soldier crumpled as the arrow found its mark in the alien's exposed neck. The room was silent for a moment, save for the faint whirring of the outpost's machinery. Calla took a deep breath, her pulse racing. She scanned the room for any more threats. Nothing moved. "They're all dead," the man said, sheathing his plasma blade. "But we're not safe yet." Calla nodded, turning toward the terminal. She had already hacked into the system once, but now she needed more. She needed to get to the core of the outpost and bring it down, once and for all. There was no going back. The aliens had taken everything from her, and it was time for them to pay. "I'm going to finish what we started," she said, her voice steady, but filled with purpose. "Hold up," the man cautioned, his gaze sharp. "We need to move quickly. The longer we stay here, the more reinforcements they'll send." He was right. The tension in the air was thick, and she could feel the pulse of the outpost's core, the beating heart of the alien facility, calling her to it. Every second they wasted here was another second the aliens could use to regroup and counterattack. They had to act fast. With one last glance at the man, Calla sprinted toward the far side of the room, where the entrance to the outpost's core was hidden behind a set of heavy blast doors. She could feel the weight of the moment, the weight of everything she had been through, everything she had survived. And she could taste the revenge that was just within her grasp. The man caught up to her, his breath heavy. "You're sure about this? It's not just the aliens you'll be taking down here. There's no going back once we access the core." "I've already made my choice," Calla replied, reaching for the terminal next to the blast doors. The symbols on the screen flickered to life, and she began typing, quickly bypassing the security measures. "I'm with you, kid," the man said. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was hard, determined. "Let's end this." The doors slid open with a deafening hiss, revealing the central core of the facility. The walls were covered in strange, glowing veins that pulsed like blood vessels, and at the center stood the heart of the outpost, a massive, crystalline energy generator. The air hummed with raw power. Calla stepped forward, her bow still clutched tightly in her hands, and approached the central console. The man stood guard, watching the shadows for any sign of movement. The silence of the room was oppressive, the calm before the storm. She placed her hand on the console, fingers hovering over the buttons. This was it. The moment everything changed. The aliens had made her their experiment, their prey, but now she would turn their weapons back on them. With a single breath, she pressed the final button. The core rumbled to life, the energy beams illuminating the entire room. The power surged, building, and the outpost began to tremble, the lights flickering and then cutting out entirely. A booming crash echoed through the walls as the facility started to collapse. The sound of alarms wailed through the halls, but Calla didn't flinch. She knew what was happening. She had set the self-destruct sequence in motion. The aliens were already losing. "Let's go," the man shouted, pulling her by the arm. They ran toward the exit, their footsteps echoing in the now chaotic structure. The walls shook with each passing second, and the sounds of explosions filled the air. Calla could feel the heat rising behind them. The outpost was coming down. There was no stopping it now. As they burst through the final set of doors, the jungle outside greeted them. The ground was shaking beneath their feet as the outpost collapsed behind them, the roar of destruction fading into the distance. Calla stopped for just a moment, taking in the sight of the jungle, the world that had become her home. She could breathe again. The man turned to her, his face grim but satisfied. "It's over." Calla looked out at the jungle, feeling the weight of everything lift from her shoulders. The aliens had tortured her. They had tried to break her. But in the end, she was still standing. "It's just beginning," she said softly. And with that, she turned toward the dense jungle, ready to face whatever came next. She had learned to fight. She had learned to survive. And now, the world was hers.